Imagine this. You're sitting alone in a quiet room, perhaps after a long day. The glow from your phone screen fades as the last curated image scrolls past your eyes. Smiling faces, travel highlights, career wins, new love. Everyone, it seems, has cracked the code to happiness. Everyone but you. There's a particular kind of silence that follows this moment. Not one of peace, but of existential unease. A hollow echo that asks, what if the pursuit itself is the problem? What if happiness is not only elusive, but deceitful? Arthur Schopenhauer, the brooding 19th-century German philosopher, believed exactly that. To him, happiness was not just rare. It was a lie dressed up in temporary pleasures and societal delusions. Beneath the polished facade of human optimism, he saw a truth so dark and so raw that most people instinctively turned away from it. But it was precisely this darkness that, in his view, led to clarity. For Schopenhauer, life was not an ascending ladder toward joy, but a cycle of suffering driven by the blind force he called the will, an unconscious, insatiable striving embedded in all things. This will is not rational. It doesn't seek peace or fulfillment. It seeks only to desire, to want endlessly. And when one desire is fulfilled, another arises, just as hungry and as urgent as the last. Happiness, then, is not a state of being. It is merely a brief interlude between pains. We forfeit 3/4 of ourselves in order to be like other people. Arthur Schopenhauer. This imitation, this chase for externally validated success and joy, Schopenhauer saw as a trap. He observed that most people do not live authentically. They live reactively, caught in a loop of societal expectations and personal cravings that can never truly be satisfied. The happiness they believe in is manufactured, a carrot dangled before the donkey, always just out of reach. But Schopenhauer was not merely cynical. He was precise. He understood that behind every smile was a shadow, behind every hope a creeping dread. And yet we are conditioned to ignore this. In modern culture, perhaps even more than in his day, happiness is marketed not just as attainable, but as obligatory. You must be happy. You should be fulfilled. Anything less is failure. What a devastating pressure to live under. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychoanalyst, once said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." But how can one accept oneself if one is taught that their natural state, uncertainty, longing, dissatisfaction, is a flaw to be corrected, not a truth to be explored? The lie of happiness, Schopenhauer argued, is that it suggests life is meant to be joyful, that fulfillment is not only possible but inevitable if one simply tries hard enough. This, he believed, was a cruel myth. Life, in his view, is not a journey toward fulfillment. It is a struggle to endure. This perspective is jarring because it demands that we question the very foundation of how we live. What if your job, your relationships, your ambitions are not paths to peace but distractions from pain? What if happiness is a form of anesthesia, keeping you from seeing the deeper, darker layers of your existence? Aldous Huxley echoed this sentiment when he wrote, "Actual happiness always looks pretty squalid in comparison with the overcompensations for misery. The dazzling image of happiness we are sold, sunsets, champagne, success, is more often than not a compensation for an underlying void. We crave happiness most desperately when we are most afraid of our own suffering." And this is where Schopenhauer begins to dig into the marrow of human existence, not to mock our hopes, but to dismantle their illusions so that we might face life honestly. He saw happiness not as a goal, but as a mistake of perception. Not as an achievement, but a miscalculation born from misunderstanding our very nature. If life is driven by a will that is never satisfied, then joy is not the endpoint, it is the bait. In this haunting framework, Schopenhauer doesn't simply critique the idea of happiness. He renders it irrelevant. And yet, in stripping away the lie, he does not leave us empty-handed. What remains, when the illusion fades, might just be the beginning of something far more profound than happiness. Desire begins as a whisper, almost imperceptible. A glance, a craving, a sudden longing. But give it just enough room and it grows claws. It becomes urgent, insistent, tyrannical. The irony is that we often confuse this rising hunger with life itself. We feel most alive when we are wanting, pursuing, grasping. Arthur Schopenhauer called this force the will, a primal, blind striving that animates all existence. It is not merely what makes us want things. It is what we are. According to Schopenhauer, the will is the root of all being, the essence of life itself. Every creature, from the lowliest insect to the most ambitious human, is enslaved to it. This will is not rational or moral. It does not care for happiness, peace, or meaning. It wants only to continue wanting. And because of that, Schopenhauer claimed that suffering is the default condition of life. For as long as we desire, we suffer. And when we attain what we desire, brief satisfaction, then boredom. And boredom, he believed, is just another form of suffering. All striving springs from lack, from deficiency, and therefore from suffering. Arthur Schopenhauer. Take a moment to think about that. Every goal you've set, every dream you've chased, according to Schopenhauer, emerges not from your abundance, but from a sense of lack. You want to be loved because you feel unloved. You seek success because you fear insignificance. You long for peace because you're caught in inner chaos. So what happens when you achieve your goal? You don't become free. You become addicted. The cycle doesn't end, it resets. Friedrich Nietzsche, who once called Schopenhauer the only philosopher worth taking seriously, would later expand on this idea by introducing the concept of eternal recurrence, the idea that we are doomed to repeat the same desires, the same sufferings over and over again. If that sounds bleak, it's because it is. And yet, like Schopenhauer, Nietzsche saw this not merely as tragedy, but as a kind of challenge to authenticity. If you had to live your life again, eternally, would you still choose it? The notion of freedom becomes murky here. Are we truly free if our desires are not chosen but inherited? Biological, social, instinctual? If we are born into hunger, not just physical but existential, how can we ever claim peace? Jean-Paul Sartre, existentialist and chronic dissector of human anguish, once said, "Man is a useless passion." This was not an insult but an observation. That human beings are driven by passions that can never be satisfied. Our desires reach further than reality allows. We want infinite meaning from finite things. We want permanence in a world built on impermanence. And in chasing these impossible wants, we enslave ourselves. Modern life has only amplified this cycle. Consumer culture, social media, even wellness trends have become arenas for feeding the will. We are told to manifest abundance, to live our best lives, to always strive for more. But more of what? We are rarely encouraged to ask that question. To ask is to pull the mask off the lie. Viktor Frankl, who endured the hell of the concentration camps, proposed a radical alternative to this constant grasping. Happiness cannot be pursued, it must ensue. This is not a contradiction of Schopenhauer, but a different response to the same truth. Frankl recognized the suffering that Schopenhauer made central, but he believed that meaning, not happiness, was the only viable answer to it. Schopenhauer, however, wasn't interested in redemption through meaning. He was interested in freedom from the will, freedom from the tyranny of desire itself. And that, for him, was not found in hope or ambition, but in renunciation. We live in a culture that glorifies desire. Follow your dreams, we are told. Never settle. But if Schopenhauer is right, then these dreams are not paths to liberation. They are the will's most seductive chains. And the longer we chase them, the more entangled we become. What does that mean for our idea of happiness? If happiness depends on desire, and desire ensures suffering, then happiness is not just an illusion, it is a trap. A trick of language. A promise the world never had any intention of keeping. But what if we stopped chasing? What if we broke the cycle? Schopenhauer believed it was possible, not by winning the game, but by refusing to play it. What if salvation doesn't come from getting more, but from wanting less? Not from climbing out of the pit, but from realizing the pit has no bottom, and stepping away from its edge entirely? Schopenhauer's philosophy offers no utopias, no comforting narratives of growth or triumph. In fact, His solution to suffering may appear, at first glance, to be a surrender. But it is not surrender, it is a revolution. A quiet, inward rebellion against the tyranny of desire and the illusion of happiness. His answer lies in a radical idea: negation of the will. The will, as he describes it, is not just personal ambition or individual craving. It is the fundamental life force, the unconscious, endless striving present in all things. To negate the will is to refuse its command, to no longer be pulled by the endless cycle of want, attain, disappoint, repeat. This is not depression. It is liberation from delusion. In this space beyond craving, Schopenhauer sees the first real glimpse of peace. Not pleasure, not joy, but the cessation of torment. The greatest wisdom is to make the enjoyment of life depend as little as possible on external things. Arthur Schopenhauer. This wisdom, for him, is not theoretical. It's a lived practice. He found its highest expression in asceticism, the voluntary renunciation of desire, possession, and worldly attachment. Not as punishment, but as purification. Not as moral superiority, but as escape from illusion. Think of the monk in silent meditation, the artist lost in the act of creation, the individual who finds solace not in accumulation but in retreat. These are not failures to engage with life, they are refusals to be enslaved by it. Schopenhauer believed that such states, especially those found in art and contemplation, offered a temporary, even mystical, escape from the will. Art, in particular, was sacred to him, not because it entertains or inspires, but because it suspends desire. For a moment, we are no longer striving, we are observing, feeling, being. Music, for Schopenhauer, was the purest form of this. It speaks not of the world, but of the will itself, stripped of its objects, its disguises. When we hear a great piece of music, we feel the pulse of existence directly, without needing to chase or name it. In those moments, something breaks. The cycle pauses. The curtain lifts. Carl Jung once said, "Your vision will become clear only when you look into your heart. Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakes." Schopenhauer would have agreed, though he would have added, "What you awaken to may not be pleasant, but it will be real." This inward turn is not for the faint of heart. To renounce the will is to give up the story we've told ourselves all our lives, that happiness lies just one achievement away. One lover, one promotion, one breakthrough. It means recognizing that nothing external can give us lasting peace. Jean-Paul Sartre described this confrontation as nausea, a sickening realization of the absurdity and emptiness behind the world's masks. But for Schopenhauer, there is no nausea, no rebellion, only quiet rejection. What makes his view so harrowing and so honest is that it denies the possibility of constructing meaning through desire. Where Viktor Frankl sees meaning as the antidote to suffering, Schopenhauer sees meaning as a byproduct of illusion. Even our search for purpose is, in his eyes, just another form of striving. To stop striving is not to die. It is to begin a new relationship with existence, one not based on consumption, but on contemplation. Not on conquest, but on stillness. This idea, so alien to our productivity-obsessed culture, is as radical now as it was then. It asks, what if success is not overcoming suffering, but seeing through it? What if the truly wise are not those who chase their dreams, but those who wake from them? Schopenhauer's worldview is not a path to happiness. It is a path beyond it, a way of living stripped of illusion, lit not by desire, but by clarity. And yet, this very clarity opens up an unsettling question. If we negate the will, if we stop striving, what remains? Is there anything left of the self once all desire is peeled away? There's something deeply unsettling about silence. Not the silence of a quiet room, but the silence that follows surrender. The silence after you've stopped chasing, when you realize the game was rigged from the start. When the noise of ambition dies, when the frantic pacing of the will finally halts. What is left of you? Arthur Schopenhauer didn't believe in a triumphant self waiting beneath the layers of striving. He believed what we call the self is itself a construction of the will, a byproduct of our endless cravings. Peel away the layers of desire, and you do not uncover a radiant soul. You uncover emptiness. But this emptiness is not annihilation. It is possibility. It is in this void, this post-desire clarity, that Schopenhauer glimpsed a new kind of peace. Not pleasure, not joy, but an almost sacred form of stillness. A state beyond the suffering of the world. He called it denial of the will to live, and he believed it could lead to a transcendence of the human condition. This isn't mystical nirvana, but something more haunting. Imagine floating just above your own life, watching without need, without want, without the compulsion to alter or possess. To most, this would seem lifeless. To Schopenhauer, it was freedom. To desire immortality is to desire the perpetuation of a great mistake. Arthur Schopenhauer. He saw even the desire for immortality, religion's promise, philosophy's fantasy, as just another mask of the will. A last-ditch effort to keep striving alive, even in the face of death. But what if, instead, we made peace with finitude, with transience? What if we did not just accept death but welcomed the end of wanting? In Buddhist philosophy, which Schopenhauer admired deeply, this state is known as nirvana, the extinguishing of the flame of desire. Not death in the physical sense, but a psychological cessation, the end of the ego's restless demands. Schopenhauer's affinity with Buddhist thought was no accident. Both traditions reject the Western idea that fulfillment lies in acquisition or identity. Both see life as fundamentally bound to suffering, and both propose renunciation, not conquest, as liberation. Yet unlike Buddhism, which often holds out compassion, reincarnation, and meditative practice as guiding lights, Schopenhauer offers little to soften the blow. His vision is austere, stripped of comfort. There is no final redemption, only release. And yet, even in this grim framework, something remarkable emerges. When all striving ceases, when the self stops clinging to meaning, identity, or achievement, what remains is not a corpse, but conscious awareness, undisturbed. This is the part Schopenhauer rarely articulates directly, but it is implied in his reverence for aesthetic experience. For brief moments, when one is lost in music, absorbed in nature, or gazing at a work of sublime art, the will pauses. The individual dissolves. And in that dissolution, there is truth. The inmost kernel of every true and great work of art is a deliverance from the individual and the will. Arthur Schopenhauer. This insight was echoed a century later by Aldous Huxley, who wrote, "To see ourselves as others see us is a most salutary gift. Hardly less important is the capacity to see others as they see themselves. When you are no longer tethered to your own hungers, you begin to see reality as it is, not as a tool to fulfill your needs, but as something that simply is. In that gaze, there is a quiet reverence, a still recognition of being. But this state is fragile. The will is not easily silenced. Even after years of contemplation or renunciation, a single desire, a longing glance, a remembered loss, a whispered hope, can reawaken the cycle. Schopenhauer knew this, and so his wisdom was not to banish desire once and for all, but to understand it so deeply that you cease to identify with it. This is not nihilism. It is transcendence through detachment. You still feel, still think, still exist, but you are no longer owned by what you feel or think or want. You are no longer the puppet of a blind force. And in that space, beyond desire, beyond the illusion of happiness, lies the seed of something more enduring. Not meaning, perhaps, but lucidity. A lucidity so pure, so unclouded, that it becomes its own kind of grace. So then we must ask, if happiness is a lie, and desire its deceiver, and the will its engine, what are we meant to do with our lives? Do we withdraw completely? Do we create? Do we serve? Do we watch? Or is there something more radical still? Something beyond both renunciation and engagement? We are not monks. Most of us do not live in caves or monasteries, and our lives are not organized around the solitary discipline of renunciation. We live in cities, in families, in jobs. We fall in love, get our hearts broken, chase dreams, crash, rebuild. The world pulls at us constantly. So what are we to do with Schopenhauer's bleak vision? How do we reconcile his call for detachment with the visceral pull of life? Is it possible to live with desire while not being enslaved by it? This is where the tension tightens. Schopenhauer gives us two options: continue playing the game of illusion and suffering, or opt out completely by negating the will. But for many, neither feels fully possible. Total renunciation is a path few can walk, and blind indulgence in desire, we now see, is a path to unending torment. So what remains? The space between the tension of being awake in the world while not fully of it. This tension is what thinkers like Viktor Frankl and Jean-Paul Sartre tried to name, each in their own way. Where Schopenhauer saw the world as fundamentally hostile to happiness, Frankl saw suffering as the crucible of meaning. Meaning, for Frankl, was not found in avoiding pain or silencing desire. It was found in how one responded to it. When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. Viktor Frankl. Frankl's ideas stand as both a challenge and a counterbalance to Schopenhauer. For where Schopenhauer invites us to withdraw from striving entirely, Frankl urges us to suffer with intention. In his view, the question isn't how to escape the pain of existence, but how to give it form. How to suffer nobly, rather than bitterly. But even Frankl does not promise happiness. He offers purpose instead. And purpose, like truth, is often inconvenient. It demands sacrifice. It asks us to walk into the storm, eyes open. The existentialists, too, grappled with this middle path. Albert Camus, perhaps the most poetic of them, described life as fundamentally absurd. An endless tension between our search for meaning and a universe that offers none. And yet, he concluded, the answer is not despair. It is defiance. The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. Albert Camus. Here we find a radical idea. Perhaps happiness isn't a goal, but a byproduct of engagement, even in a world that offers no ultimate reward. Perhaps we find dignity not in overcoming the absurd, but in refusing to look away from it. And yet Schopenhauer would remain unconvinced. He would see even this defiance as another expression of the will, another mask, another cycle. To fight meaninglessness is still to cling to desire, still to be caught. So again we ask, is there a way to live within this contradiction? To neither escape the world completely, nor be consumed by it. Carl Jung believed so. He saw human life as a balancing act between opposites, between light and shadow, conscious and unconscious, desire and restraint. He believed that wholeness was not about perfection but integration. I am not what happened to me, I am what I choose to become. Carl Jung. Jung's path is neither Schopenhauer's withdrawal nor Camus' rebellion. It is alchemical, a slow transformation of the psyche through acceptance of suffering, shadow, contradiction. In this view, the lie of happiness becomes an opportunity, not to escape the world, but to understand our projections upon it. We are not required to eradicate desire, but to see it clearly, to stop mistaking it for salvation. That clarity alone changes everything. When we stop expecting life to make us happy, we begin to engage with it more honestly. We stop using people, careers, and philosophies as tools to fill a void. We begin to see them for what they are: impermanent, flawed, beautiful in their limitations. We begin to suffer with eyes open, rather than blindfolded by false hopes. This is not the happiness sold to us in marketing campaigns or Instagram reels. It is a quieter, rawer kind of peace, a sense of standing on firm ground, not because the storm has stopped, but because we no longer pretend the storm isn't real. Schopenhauer would not call this happiness. He would likely call it wisdom or resignation, but perhaps it's something more than that, a mode of being that stares reality in the face and no longer flinches. But even if we find clarity, one final question remains: why live at all? If happiness is a lie, desire is suffering, and even meaning is another mask, then what ultimately justifies the endurance of life? The answer to that question, perhaps the most unsettling of all, comes next. If happiness is an illusion, if meaning is a consolation, and if desire only deepens our suffering, then the most honest question left standing is the most dangerous one of all. Why live at all? Arthur Schopenhauer didn't shy away from this question. In fact, he placed it at the center of his entire philosophical project. While others tried to build systems of progress, salvation, or self-actualization, Schopenhauer laid bare the brutal mechanics of suffering and asked, what could possibly justify this endless cycle of pain and frustration? For some, the answer might be faith, God's plan, karma, cosmic justice. But Schopenhauer rejected those answers. To him, they were just more fictions built to obscure the truth. The universe, in his view, is not governed by a benevolent deity or cosmic balance. It is driven by the blind, indifferent will, creates not with purpose, but with hunger, and that hunger spares nothing. Human life must be some kind of mistake. Arthur Schopenhauer. A statement like that feels like a philosophical death sentence. But perhaps that's precisely the point. If you push hard enough, if you strip away every illusion, Schopenhauer believed you might arrive at a kind of truth most are too terrified to face. Life, in its rawest form, does not make sense. It does not have to. Simply is, and it hurts. So again, why live? Not because life promises happiness, not because it promises meaning, but because it is the only field in which truth can be confronted. And that confrontation, that clarity, might just be more valuable than all the fleeting comforts happiness could ever offer. Where other thinkers sought to redeem life, Schopenhauer aimed only to understand it. But understanding, in his hands, becomes a kind of redemption. If we cannot be saved from suffering, perhaps we can be freed from its illusion. If we cannot escape the will, perhaps we can stand apart from it, watching it, naming it, refusing to identify with it. This refusal, this act of spiritual defiance, is what gives Schopenhauer's bleak vision a surprising depth of dignity. He does not tell us to seek joy, but to seek truth. He does not tell us to conquer suffering, but to see through the mirage that suffering hides behind. Hope, desire, false promises of happiness. And in this way, his thought does not lead us to despair. It leads us to stillness, to a life lived consciously, stripped of illusions. Perhaps not a joyful life, but a life that is honest. A man can do what he wills, but he cannot will what he wills. Arthur Schopenhauer. This insight, so often misunderstood, is devastating. It means we are not free in the way we like to believe. Our desires are not chosen, but arise from deeper forces we do not control. But within that unfreedom lies a strange kind of power. The power to understand, to observe, to step back. We do not choose what we want, but we can choose to stop lying to ourselves about what those wants will give us. This is where Schopenhauer's legacy intersects, paradoxically, with freedom. Not the freedom to mold life into what we wish, but the freedom to stop being deceived by what we wish for. And that kind of freedom may be more enduring than happiness could ever be. The world, stripped of illusion, may not be beautiful in the conventional sense, but it is sublime, terrible, immense, sacred. To live in full awareness of its indifference, its suffering, its broken rhythms, and still continue on is not weakness. It is a form of courage few ever touch. Aldous Huxley once wrote, "Experience is not what happens to you. It's what you do with what happens to you." Schopenhauer might have added, and sometimes what you do with it is simply to understand it, to see it not as a means to an end but as the end itself. So why live? Not because life will fulfill you, but because to see clearly, even once, is worth every moment of suffering that led you there. To awaken from the lie of happiness is not to fall into despair. It is to become, perhaps for the first time, fully human. Not chasing, not clinging, simply being in all the terror and all the truth that entails. And maybe, just maybe, there is a kind of grace in that. A grace beyond happiness. A grace that asks for nothing and gives everything.